Yeah, that was a beautiful introduction. It's such an honor to be in conversation with you here today. Preparing for this conversation was also incredibly fun. We just heard a little bit about your background that I learned while I was researching you. You were raised by a single mother in public housing in the Bronx. You're one of the few congressmen serving that doesn't hold a college degree. You speak very openly about your struggles with mental health, and you're the first Afro-American openly gay congressperson to serve in U.S. history, correct?
I have more intersecting identities than George Santos.
Yes. And they all seem to be true.
And for the record, after the explosion of George Santos, I became the most prominent Jewish gay Latino congressman of New York. So you forgot to mention that in the introduction. So, no.
Well, tell us more about your journey, what led you to run for office, and how your lived experiences impact your role in Congress.
The starting point for me is the Bronx. I mean, I never thought life would take me on a journey from public housing in the Bronx to the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. The Bronx is the only home I've ever known, born and raised there, and now represent about half the borough. And I was raised by a single mother who had to raise three of us on minimum wage, which in the 1990s was $4.25 an hour. And I would not be here today were it not for my hero, my mother. And I feel like the greatest honor of my life is representing the Bronx, which is full of single mothers like mine, struggled, sacrificed, and struggled and suffered so that their children and grandchildren can have a fighting chance at the American dream. My rule in life is if you're doing right by the wise Latinas and Jewish mothers, then you're succeeding as an elected official.
Yeah, you're going to do well.
I think it's been said that a happy wife is a happy life. Since I'm gay, that doesn't quite work for me, but but a happy mother is a happy life. And in fact, when I won my primary, I publicly said that before I was a congressman or a councilman, I'm first and foremost the son of my mother, Deborah Vassalette. I'm 36, so I've been engaged in politics for about 20 years. I ran for office for the first time when I was 25. I had no deep pockets, no ties to the party machine, but I just spent a whole year doing nothing but knocking on doors. I went to people's homes. I heard their stories, and I won my first campaign on the strength of door-to-door campaigning. Became the first openly LGBTQ elected official from the Bronx. What's unusual about my life is, as you noted, I dropped out of college. About 15 years ago, I found myself at the lowest point in my life. I had dropped out of college. I found myself abusing substances. There were moments when I even thought of taking my own life because I felt as if the world around me had collapsed. And I never thought in my wildest dreams that I would have an opportunity to rebuild my life and then 7 years later become the youngest elected official in America's largest city, and then 7 years later become a member of the United States Congress. And
That's
so
phenomenal.
I feel like only in America is a story like mine possible. So.
Yeah.
And I happen to be a twin. I'm the favorite son. Here's how I can prove it. When my mother was watching the movie La Bamba, she named me after Ritchie Valens, which is Ritchie with a T, and she named my brother after the Reuben sandwich.
Yeah, you clearly won
From
that.
which I rightly inferred that I'm clearly the favorite son. Yeah.
Good conclusion. Young, gay, Afro-Latino, liberal Zionist.
Yep.
These are not adjectives we're used to hearing to describe the same person today. What drives your passion for the state of Israel?
Well, I'll confess that, I'm something of an improbable Zionist because for much of my life, I had no knowledge of Israel. I grew up in a community that was almost exclusively Latino and African American, so I had no engagement with the Jewish community. I had no reason to think about Israel. And then when I became a member of the New York City Council, I was invited by the Jewish Community Relations Council to go on a delegation to Israel. It was the first time I had an opportunity to travel abroad. And it reshaped the trajectory of my life. Going to Yad Vashem, going to the Masada, going to the Gaza envelope. I remember speaking to the local mayor of Sderot, who said that the majority of his children struggle with post-traumatic stress because families like his live under the threat of relentless rocket fire. I remember seeing bus stops doubling as bomb shelters, and I thought to myself, imagine the sheer trauma of a 5-year-old Israeli child seeking refuge in a bomb shelter while sirens are going off and rockets are being fired and adults are panicking in a state of pandemonium. And I come from a rough neighborhood in the Bronx. I represent people who live in fear of bullets and guns, but no one in America lives in fear of rockets, right? None of us worry that Mexico and Canada are going to fire rockets into American homes and communities. And so my early engagement with Israel, enabled me to understand the complex security situation that Israel faces, which has no equivalent anywhere in the United States or, in fact, anywhere in the world.
Yes, very true. I heard an interview with you, and you said...
But my real reason for being pro-Israel is I want to be the Grand Marshal of the Tel Aviv Pride Parade.
Okay, yeah. I think someone in here can make that happen. I hear it's a great time. Clearly no, because you're still here. I listened to an interview with you, and you said, quote, "I didn't leave the progressive movement. The progressive movement left me." And that the progressive movement had become radicalized. This is a common theme that I hear in conversations in circles that I'm in. Can you tell us more what you meant by that, and what message you have for those who feel unwelcome in progressive spaces because of their support for Israel?
So I'll share what's unfolding in New York City, which I suspect is happening here in California. One of the most powerful institutions in New York City politics is the New York City Democratic Socialists of America. And back in 2000, the DSA sent a questionnaire to city council candidates. It was about 15 pages, and the final page was a foreign policy section, because members of the New York City Council have a major role in setting foreign policy. But there were only 2 questions, and both of them were about Israel. Question number 1, do you pledge never to travel to Israel if elected to the city council?
Wow.
Question number 2, do you pledge to support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel?
Oh my goodness.
And so, from the democratic socialist worldview, it's permissible to travel to China, which is committing genocide against Uyghur Muslims.
Right.
Or to travel to Russia, which has invaded a sovereign nation state, Ukraine. Or to travel to Iran, which is the leading sponsor of terrorism in the world, or Myanmar, which has ethnically cleansed Rohingya Muslims. But travel to the world's only Jewish state, that is strictly forbidden.
Right.
And for me, if that is not evidence of anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, then I'm not sure what would be. And so I'm just convinced any movement that embraces anti-Semitism, including in its anti-Zionist form, will ultimately rot from within.
I think you bring up an excellent...
And my concern is that organizations like the DSA could be to American politics what Jeremy Corbyn became to the Labour Party in British politics. And I feel like the burden falls on pro-Israel Democrats like myself to actively resist the Jeremy Corbynization of progressive politics.
Thank you. You bring up an excellent point, and I think the audience that we have here today understands that anti-Semitism is a form of hate that reincarnates itself to meet the moment in history. Yeah. And at this moment in history, Jews in Israel are being portrayed as white colonizers or oppressors or even white supremacists, while jihadist groups like Hamas, the Houthis, and Hezbollah have been reimagined as kind of oppressed freedom fighters, which is just wild. It seems this movement has used the framework of racial politics in America and put it onto a conflict a world away. Do you agree with this framing? And if so, how do you see it playing out in Washington?
It might come as a shock to you. No, I don't agree with it. But, to your point, there seems to be an ideology that divides the world into oppressor versus the oppressed. And so for organizations like the DSA, Israel is the oppressor that can do no right. Mm-hmm. and Hamas is the oppressed that can do no wrong. And that's the distorting, simplistic lens through which the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is seen. And the benefit of that framework is that it spares you the burden of critical thinking, because it requires you to know nothing about the historical context, nothing about the facts. But I see it as a dangerous framework because it leads to organizations cheering and celebrating the barbaric murder of Jews on October 7th. Like for me, if we as a society cannot clearly condemn the terrorism of October 7th, then we're in danger of rotting from within. So I just see it as basic morality.
Amen to that. And if someone could give me a 3-minute, okay, thanks. So last week you tweeted out a video, and it was an excellent video, and the overarching theme of it, and a quote from you was, "Beware of false narratives that portray self-defense of Israel as aggression, and the aggression of Iran and Hezbollah as self-defense." Can you elaborate to the audience what you meant by that? And then, do you think that the media's portrayal of this war has contributed to anti-Semitism and the current political climate in the United States surrounding Israel?
Look, I find whenever Israel dares to defend itself, the media invokes the term escalation. Right? There is an insidious portrayal of Israeli self-defense as aggression. And I remember during the vice presidential debate, the commentators asked the vice presidential candidates, would you support a preemptive strike against Iran? Well, Iran just launched the largest barrage of ballistic missiles that has ever been undertaken against any nation state, right? If Israel were to respond, Israel would not be acting preemptively. It would be acting defensively. Like whether you,
right.
And so there's an insistence on portraying everything that Israel does as aggression. And look, when Hezbollah was firing up to 10,000 rockets against Israel, no one was using the word escalation. No one was accusing Hezbollah of engaging in escalation. And I tell people, imagine if we were living in close proximity to the world's most powerful terrorist organization. And imagine if the terrorist organization were firing 10,000 rockets at American homes and communities in the span of a year, displacing up to 100,000 Americans, even murdering children with their indiscriminate rocket fire. Does anyone think that we would wait 1 year before responding?
I hope not.
Like, Israel has shown remarkable restraint in the face of unprecedented aggression from the most heavily armed terrorist organization in the world.
Absolutely. To that end, so yesterday we saw that Hezbollah attacked Israel with a drone attack. 4 soldiers were killed, dozens others were greatly injured. Today, or yesterday, the Biden administration announced that it was going to send a THAAD machinery, I guess, a ballistic missile defense system. Yeah, thank you, and 100 troops. I was going to ask you, the framing that America was supporting Israel not to victory, but to a tie. But after yesterday's move, do you think that that changes the dynamic of the support of America's support of Israel in this war?
Look, I feel the Biden-Harris administration has been fundamentally supportive of Israel in its moment of greatest need. I thought within the first week of October 7th, President Biden gave the most powerful speech of his presidency.
Yes. And
he sent not 1 but 2 carriers to the Mediterranean. He championed the National Security Supplemental, which appropriated about $13 to $14 billion for Israel's self-defense. I thought the success in intercepting the missiles and rockets and drones from Iran, both in April and in October, was a triumph of the U.S.-Israel relationship. And, Israel has had success in degrading Hamas in Gaza. It's had far more success in degrading and decapitating the leadership of Hezbollah than anyone anticipated. So I feel like Israel has been given the tools to defend itself. Obviously, there have been disagreements, but you know, it's like a marriage, right? Every marriage has the U.S.-Israel relationship is like a marriage, and except for the marriages in this room, every marriage has differences of opinion and tensions and disagreement. But there's no doubt in my mind that both President Biden and Vice President Harris will stand with Israel during its moment of greatest need. You know, one thing that worries me is, and my partisan bias will show here, you know, is the rise of isolationism in American politics. You know, and even if one thought that Donald Trump was pro-Israel, I happen to think Donald Trump is just pro-Donald Trump. But even if you stipulate that he's pro-Israel, I worry that he functions as a gravitational force that's going to pull America in a more isolationist direction.
Yes.
And I would submit to you that America First isolationism is ultimately no friend of the U.S.-Israel relationship. You know, I think of isolationism... Yes. You know, I think of isolationism as the global equivalent of defunding the police, you know. And actually, Charles Barkley once said, "Who are you going to call, Ghostbusters?" Which I thought was a good response. But, you know, if the United States isolates itself from the world,
Yes.
and if we create a power vacuum, who's going to fill that power vacuum? It's going to be China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. We're going to see the rise of an axis of anti-Americanism, which will operate to the detriment of Israel and the U.S.-Israel relationship. So I feel like history has shown that Israel thrives in a context of American leadership.
Yes. It's like that horseshoe, the anti-democratic horseshoe. So we have a little bit more time here. I'm going to ask you 2 more questions here. I'm going to take a slight detour in the conversation because your district in New York and this beautiful city of San Francisco have some synergies when it comes to complications in the issues that we're dealing with as a city. Specifically,
We have no issues in New York. No indictment, no FBI.
No, nothing. But specifically the open-air drug markets and the rise of drug-addicted people on our streets. My own father has suffered the consequences of addiction for decades, so I understand that there's a lot of difficulties around addressing this issue. And I recently saw that you posted a local news segment talking about what you have done in your district to help clean up the streets, and the streets looked awesome. And then it went on to kind of show that it really just kind of moved the problem to a different location. We're dealing with that here too in San Francisco. So can you talk about the challenges you experienced in addressing this issue, and then ways that you see that this could be solved, and should this be maybe something that Congress takes action on instead of leaving it to be a city-by-city issue?
Yeah, so in an area known as the Hub, which is the beating heart of the South Bronx, there was effectively an open-air drug market. There were drug addicts on the streets who were openly injecting themselves in broad daylight in the presence of children. And my view was, if this were the Upper East Side of Manhattan, that never would have been tolerated. My view is that poor people of color in the Bronx should not be subject to a lower quality of life and lower standards of public safety. And I'm not necessarily in favor of criminalizing drug addicts, but there's nothing progressive or compassionate about allowing drug addicts to languish and die on the streets. We should be connecting them to healthcare services. And, you know, for me, the issue of mental health is deeply personal. I've spent most of my life struggling with depression. Right, every morning I wake up and take an antidepressant, Wellbutrin XL, and it enables me to be a productive public servant. Like, I feel no shame in admitting I would not be alive today, much less a member of Congress, were it not for mental health care and the stability it brought to my life. And so Congress certainly has a role to play in dramatically breaking down the barriers to accessing mental health care in America.
Amen to that. The environment in Washington has become completely partisan and gridlocked. But you co-sponsored a bill, the No Foreign Gifts Act, with Republican Andrew Garbino. So tell us about that bill, and are there other opportunities you see to work across the aisle going forward in Congress, and how has working across the aisle changed since you've been in Congress?
Yeah, so look, one of the disproportionate drivers of anti-Semitism in our society has been college campuses. I have a running joke when people ask me, why are you so pro-Israel? I say, because I dropped out of college. But that's, but in all seriousness, look, there's no magic bullet to solve the crisis of campus anti-Semitism, but one of the concerns is the malicious influence of foreign gifts. And so the legislation I introduced has a simple proposition, right? If you are a foreign adversary of the United States, like China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, or if you are a state sponsor of terrorism, like Qatar, you should be prohibited from contributing foreign gifts to institutions of higher learning within the United States. And I'll give you one example. There was a public school in Brooklyn that had an after-school program that presented students with an image of the Middle East where Israel was completely wiped off the map. And it turns out that that program was funded by the Qatari International Foundation.
Wild.
And so I called the chancellor and I said, and this I called the chancellor before he was raided by the FBI, by the way. But I called the chancellor and I said to him, like, do you not review the materials that your students, that are exposed to your students? And he said, I'm not in a position to review everything my students read. And I said, you don't have to review everything your students read. Just review the materials coming from the Qatari International Foundation.
Smart.
Let's start there.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one last question. We have an election coming up in 3 weeks. What are you most concerned about, and what are you most hopeful for? Let's end on a high note.
What am I concerned about? Well, look, I became a member of Congress on January 3rd of 2021. So January 6th was my third day on the job.
Wow.
So I worry about a repeat of January 6th. You know, if someone had said to a younger version of myself, Ritchie, you're going to become a member of Congress during a global pandemic and witness an insurrection and then vote to impeach the host of The Celebrity Apprentice.
Oh my God.
And all of that would happen within the first 2 weeks, I would have said that sounds almost like a movie. But in all seriousness, I worry about, you know, for me, in order for us to succeed as a democracy, we have to all accept the outcome of elections, the peaceful transfer of power. And I do worry about political violence in the aftermath of the election. I also worry about the attempted assassinations. You know, after the first attempted assassination of former President Trump, I reached out to a Republican colleague and said, you know, we should introduce a bill together that enhances Secret Service protection for both the Democratic nominee and the Republican nominee in a spirit of bipartisan and bicameral unity. And after the second attempted assassination, the bill passed unanimously, both in the House and the Senate.
Well done.
Because I feel deeply that, you know, we are in danger of turning the clock back to the 1960s.
Yes.
You know, when we saw the assassination of a president and a presidential candidate, a civil rights leader. And I feel deeply in my heart that we should do everything we can to prevent a repeat of our worst history of political violence and political assassinations.
Wonderful. And what are you hopeful for?
What am I hopeful for?
This is small thing to leave us with some optimism here.
Look, I remain bullish about America. I feel like we are the greatest country on earth. We're the greatest experiment in multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy the world has ever seen. I feel like we have a wealth of talent. You know, our greatest adversary is not China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Our greatest adversary is ourselves. right? It's the deepening dysfunction and maddening myopia of our politics. But if we can elect the right people, I feel like there's no limit to what we can accomplish as a country. So I'm eternally optimistic about what our country is capable of producing, and I think of myself as a liberal, a patriotic liberal Democrat. And the best definition of patriotic liberalism came from Bill Clinton, who once said that there's nothing that's wrong with America that cannot be cured by what's right with America.
Well
And
said.
I feel the same about Israel. I feel like there's nothing that's wrong with Israel that cannot be cured by what's right with Israel. And the story of America, much like the story of Israel, is not a story of perfection. It's a story of progress. It's a story of constant struggle and striving and self-improvement. And that's a story that I believe in deeply with all my heart. So.
Wonderful, thank you. So, not yet, not yet. Okay, before you leave, is my mic still on? I don't know. What? Okay. Before you leave, Congressman, this is a thank you from the Federation. A heartfelt thanks for your unwavering commitment to standing against anti-Semitism and your support for the Jewish community. I'm honored to present you with this shofar, and the shofar is a ram's horn that's used kind of like a trumpet. And in the Jewish tradition, it's often used as a call to action. Today, this represents the summons to awaken hearts, a reminder of the strength needed to fight injustice and the pursuit of freedom and dignity for all. Just as the sound echoes through generations, your actions resonate deeply for the future, rooted in tolerance and respect. So we thank you.